Book 3, Chapter 55, continuing with verse 34. But all these appearances are as empty as air. The soul alone is the sentient principle, and vast space and time and the modes and motions of things, though they appear as real, are in reality nothing. Here in Yama's court, the soul is pronounced to reap the reward of its acts, whereby it ascends either to the blissful heaven above or descends to the painful hell below. After having enjoyed the bliss of heaven or suffered the torment of hell, the soul is doomed to wander in this earth again, to reap the reward of its acts in repeated incarnations. The soul springs up like a paddy plant and brings forth the grains of intelligence. Then, being assembled by the senses, it becomes an animal, and lastly, an intelligent being. The soul contains in itself the germs of all its senses, which lie dormant in it for lack of its bodily organs. It is contained in the man's virile semen, which, passing into the uterus, produces the fetus in the womb of the female. The fetus then becomes either well-formed or deformed according to the good or evil deeds of the person in its past state, and brings forth the infant of a good or ill-shaped appearance. These last statements are very significant, and we can apply them to our understanding of how karma works and the whole process of reincarnation, the 4 million different species in which an individual jiva can incarnate into. It is extremely clear and lucid expression of the reality of this illusion that we live in. The reality of nothing. Just an illusion. It then perceives the moon-like beauty of youthful bloom, and its amorous disposition comes upon itself. Afterward, it feels the effects of hoary old age, defacing its lotus-like face, like the sleets of snow shatter and shrivel the lotus leaflets. At last it undergoes the pains of disease and death, and feels the same lack of physical senses of death as before, and finds itself again as in a dream, taking on a new form. It again believes itself to be carried to the region of Yama and subjected to the former kinds of revolution. Then it continues to conceive its reincarnation in endless births and various forms. Thus forever it is its own ethereal sphere. The aerial spirit goes on thinking about all its ceaseless reincarnations until its final liberation from this ever-changing state. Leela said, Tell me kindly, O good goddess, for the enlightenment of my understanding, how did this misconception of its changeableness first come upon the soul in the beginning? The goddess replied, the dense appearance of the abstract causes us to assume the discrete spirit in the concrete forms of the earth and sky and rocks and trees. As divine consciousness manifests itself as the soul and model of all forms, so we see these manifestations in the transcendental sphere of its pure consciousness. In the beginning, God conceived himself as the Lord of creation, Brahma. Then, as it were, in a dream, he saw in himself all the forms as they continue to this time. These forms were manifested in the divine spirit, but first as his will, and then reflected and exhibited in the phenomenal world in all their present forms. Among these, some are called living beings, which are able to move their bodies and limbs and live by means of the air they breathe and circulate in their bodies through lungs and arteries. Such also is the creation of plant life. They have their inner sensitivity, though devoid of outward motion, and they receive their sustenance from their roots. The hollow sphere of the divine intellect, beaming with intelligence, sends forth its particles of perception, which form the consciousness of some beings and sensitivity in others. But man uses his eyes to view the outer and the reflected world. Although the eyes do not form his individual soul, nor did they exist at his creation or before his birth. It is according to one's estimation of himself that he has his proper and peculiar desires, and also the particular form of his body. Such also is the case of the elemental bodies. From their inner conception of this peculiar nature. Thus, all moving and unmoving things have their movable and immovable bodies according to their intrinsic disposition or idiosyncrasy as such and such. Hence, all self-moving beings have their movable bodies conforming to the conception of their natures as so and so. And in this state of their belief, they continue to this time with the same inborn or congenital bodies. The vegetable world still continues in the same state of fixedness from its sense of immobility. And so rocks and minerals continue in their inert state from the inborn sense of their inertness. There is no distinction whatever between inertness and intelligence, nor any difference between production, continuance, and extinction of things. All occurs in one common essence of the Supreme. The varying characteristics existing in plants and minerals make them feel themselves as such and such, cause their various natures and forms as they have to this time. The inner constitution of all immovable objects makes them remain in their stationary states. Likewise, for all other substances, according to their different names and natures. Thus, the inner constitution or quality of worms and insects makes them conceive themselves according to their different kinds and gives them their particular natures forever. So the people under the North Pole know nothing about those in the South, other than what they know of themselves. So also all kinds of moving and unmoving beings are prepossessed with their own notions of things and regard all others according to their own peculiar self-concept. Again, as the inhabitants of caves know nothing of their outsiders, and as frogs in dirty pools are unacquainted with the pure water of streams, so is one sort of being ignorant of the nature of another. But empty consciousness, residing in the form of the all-pervasive mind and all-sustaining air, knows the natures of all things in all places. The moving principle is the vital air that enters all bodies through their pores and which gives life and motion to all living beings. Truly, the mind is situated in all things, whether they are moving or immovable. And so is the air, which causes motion in some and stillness in others. Thus, all things in this world of illusion are only the rays of the conscious soul, continuing in the same state as they have from the beginning. I have told you everything about the nature of things in the world and how unrealities come to appear as real unto us. Look, here is King Vidaratha. He is about to breathe his last, and the garlands of flowers heaped on the corpse of your husband Padma are now being hung upon the breast of Vidaratha. Lila said, "Tell me, goddess, How did Vidaratha enter Padma's tomb? How can we also enter to see what is doing there? The goddess said, man goes to all places by the way of his desires, even thinking that he goes to a distant future in the spiritual form of pure consciousness. We shall go the same way as you like, because the bond of our friendship makes no difference in our choice and desires. Vasishta said. Princess Leela was relieved of her pain by what Goddess Saraswati had explained. Her intellectual sight was brightened by the blazing sun of spiritual light. She saw the unconscious and unmoving Vidaratha breathe out his final breath. Chapter 56. State of the soul after death. Ancestor worship and benefit to the dead. Vasishta continued. In the meantime, the king's eyeballs became convoluted, and his lips and cheeks and entire face grew pale and dry. There remained only the slender breath of life in him. His body became as lean as a dry leaf, and his face turned as ghastly as the figure of death. His throat gurgled like the hoarsest beetles, and his lungs breathed with abated breath. His sight was darkened upon the unconsciousness of death, and his hopes were buried in the pit of despair. The sensations of his external organ were hidden within the cavity of his heart. His figure was as senseless as a picture in painting, and all his limbs were as motionless as those of a statue, carved from a block of marble. What need is there of a lengthier description when it may be said in short, that his life quitted his body like a bird flies far away from a falling tree. The two ladies, with their divine eyesight, saw his animal spirit in its aerial form, flying upwards in the sky, and his consciousness disappearing like the odor of a flower blown by the wind. His individual soul, being joined with his spiritual body, began to fly higher and higher in the air as it was led by his inner desire or expectation of ascending to heaven. The two ladies kept following that conscious soul, like a couple of female bees pursuing a particle of perfume, borne afar in the air on the wings of the wind. Then, in a moment after the fainting fit of death was over, the conscious soul was roused from its unconsciousness like some fragrance expanding itself with the breeze. It saw the porters of death carrying away the souls of the dead that had resumed their grosser forms from the food offered by their kinsmen during ancestor worship rituals. After a long year's journey on the way, it reached the distant abode of Yama with the hope of reaping the reward of its acts, but found the gate guarded by beasts of prey. Yama, on seeing the departed spirit of everybody brought before him, demanded to know all its foul acts committed during its lifetime. On finding the prince's spirit spotless, ever inclined to virtuous acts, and nourished by the grace of the goddess of wisdom, he ordered it to be released. The spirit re-entered his former dead body that lay buried under the flowers in the tomb. It was then allowed to fly in the ethereal path with the swiftness of a stone shot from a sling. The living Leela and the goddess followed in the air. The individual soul of the king, sailing through the sky, did not see the forms of the two ladies who followed, though they saw it all along its course. They passed through many worlds and soon passed beyond the bounds of the extra-mundane systems until they arrived at the solar world from where they descended to this earth. The two self-willed forms of Leela and the goddess followed the individual soul of King Padma and arrived at his royal city, where they entered Leela's apartment. In a thrice and of their own free will, they entered the palace of King Padma like air passes in flowers and sunbeams penetrate water and odors mixed with air. Rama asked, how was it, sage, that they entered into the abode adjoining to the tomb? And how could they find their way to it? One had been dead a long time, and all three were bodiless emptiness. Vasishta replied, the tomb of the king's body, being impressed on his soul and the object of his desire, led his spirit insensibly to it, as if by its inborn instinct. Who does not know that the endless desires in the human breast, like countless fig seeds, grow up in time to become big trees? Just as the living body bears its seed, the subtle body, lingadeha, and the heart that germinates and in the end grows into a tree, so every particle of the intellect bears the material seed in itself. As a man placed in a far distant land sees his own house within himself, So the soul sees the objects of its distant desires ever present before it. The individual soul always longs after the best objects of its desire, even though it may undergo 100 births and become subject to the errors and delusions of his senses of this illusory world. Brahma replied, there are many persons who are free from desire to receive funeral cakes. Now tell me, sage, what becomes of those souls who get no cake offering at their ancestor worship, Shraddha? Vasishta replied, a man having the desire settled in his heart to receive food offerings and thinking it to be offered to him is surely benefited by its offering. Whatever is in the heart and mind, the same notions form the nature of living beings, whether there are in their incorporeal or corporeal states. They think themselves as such beings and no other. Thought of having received the pinda cake offered at a Shraddha ancestor worship ritual makes a man sapinda, ancestors to this 6th degree, though it is not actually offered to him. On the other hand, the thoughts of not being served with cake makes a sapinda become a nishpinda. It is truly the desire of all living beings to be whatever they have in their hearts. And that is the cause of their becoming so in reality. It is a man's thought that makes poison taste like nectar. And it is his very thought that makes an untruth seem as truth to him. Know this for certain. There is no thought ever rises in anyone without some cause or other. Therefore, the desire or thought that is inherent in the spirit is the sole cause of its regeneration on earth. Nobody has ever seen or heard of any event occurring without its proper cause, except the being of the Supreme Being, which is the causeless cause of all beings from their state of not being into being. Desire is inherent in consciousness like a dream in the soul. Desire appears in the form of acts as the will of God is manifested in his works of creation. Rama said, how can a spirit that is conscious of its faults foster any desire for its future good? How can it benefit from others' pious works for its salvation? Tell me also whether the pious acts of others offered to ancestors go for nothing. Do the good wishes of others have any effect on the future prospects of an undeserving ghost? Vasishta said, a desire arises in its proper time and place and by application of appropriate acts and means. The rising of the desire necessarily overcomes its absence. Pious gifts made for the sake of departed souls accrue to them as their own acts. It gives them a sense of worthiness and fills them with better hopes and desires for their future state. Just like the stronger man gains the better of his adversary, so the latter acts of piety drive away the former impiety from the spirit. Therefore, the constant practice of pious acts is strictly encouraged in the scriptures. Ram said, if the desire rises in its proper time and place, then how could it arise in the beginning when there was no time or place? You say that there are accessory causes that give rise to desires. But how could the will arise in the first place without any accessory cause whatever? Vasishta replied, it is true, O long-armed Ram, that there was neither time nor place in the beginning when the Spirit of God was without its will. And there being no accessory cause, there was not even the idea of the visible world, nor was it created or brought into existence. It is so even now. The phenomenal world has no existence. All that is visible is the manifestation of divine consciousness, which is everlasting and imperishable. Later, I will explain this to you in 100 different ways. And it is my main purpose to do so. But now tell you what relates to the matter under consideration. Having arrived in that house, they saw its inside beautifully decorated with garlands of flowers as fresh as those of the spring season. Now it's interesting to notice the strategy being employed here in the presentation of the Yoga Vasishta and the beauty of the translation that has been created from the original Sanskrit. This translation is poetry. It is incredible. It is really a beautiful translation. But the strategy being employed is to first or second, but at some point, take you behind the scene to show you how the magician is creating the magic. This is being done in verse 44. Verse 44, Saraswati, the Shakti of Brahma, the creator, the intelligence of the creator, basically, the creator speaking. The phenomenal world has no existence. All that is visible is the manifestation of divine consciousness, which is everlasting and imperishable. So that's our peek behind the curtains. And then in verse 46, we come out and join the audience. And we observe the magic show. Having arrived in that house, they saw it's beautifully decorated with garlands of flowers as fresh as those of the spring season. That is a poetic statement. It's designed to evoke an image in your mind that connects with all five senses, to engage not only your conscious thinking mind, but also your emotional body, your prana maya kosha mind. And as the statements continue, there will be enough detail to engage monomaya kosha mind. By engaging these three minds, and then periodically injecting pure divine karmic traces. Divine karmic traces, those are the ones used to create the universe that is the ultimate truth in this universe, which is given to us in verse 44. The effect will be felt on all three levels, meaning individual karmic traces that exist, which are discordant with these divine karmic traces, the opposite of them, are going to be balanced. So it's quite masterful and delightful to engage in this reading.